Welcome back. So this is the 8th part of an 8-part series that we've been doing this year, exploring our principles. And we have now come to the proposed 8th principle. And it's a proposed principle, and I didn't really understand everything about it, but I think I know a little more today, so we're going to get into it. So the 8th principle is, just as a foundational point, it's a grassroots effort. I don't know if everybody was aware of that. It's a grassroots effort. It's a lay-led grassroots effort. So it's two leaders who at the 2017 General Assembly saw a need and had an idea. And some of that was in our gathering thought. But let's just take a look at the 8th principle. We affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in our institutions. And so I was sharing with Pam before the service that when I was in Pittsburgh, I actually got to meet Paula Cole Jones, who was one of the authors of this principle. And looking into where did it come from and listening to some conversations that she's recorded about how it happened, I was intrigued to find out that, one, if you don't know, Paula Cole Jones is a woman of color. She's an African-American lady. She lives in Washington, D.C., and ironically, she's a lifelong UU. I say ironically because for me that's a big deal because I've only been around and known what a UU was for a little over 5-6 years. But she's a lifelong UU, and she's from a very diverse congregation in Washington, D.C., and she shares that for much of her life, she thought that's how all of UU was everywhere out in the world. And specifically, it was 2017, and it was right after the George Zimmerman acquittal for the killing of Trayvon Martin down in South Florida. The two organizers came together, and his name is Bruce Pollock Johnson. And the reason that they sought to move this idea to the center of our spiritual life was because they said that around the country there was a lack of perceived concern and a lack of people to articulate concern over the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And so it was interesting because she said because her life had been centered on inclusion and diversity and it was something that was important to her, it's something that came naturally to her. And what she observed is it wasn't coming naturally to other people. And so because of that, she wanted it to be more particularly she spoke of the next generation. And we don't have any children in the sanctuary today, but I see some very young faces and some very energetic eyeballs. And she said for the next generation, she was hoping that by recentering the 8th principle, it would create more of an intuitive nature towards inclusion, much like the 2 or 3-year-olds are able to deal with an iPad or a telephone intuitively. They don't need a conversation and a discussion and a debate about how to use an iPad. And so during a time of all ages in our churches that have adopted the 8th principle, there's a change in the conversation that allows it to be more intuitive. And this was back in 2017 that she had this idea. So I was curious about the history of how we got here from 2017. So I'm going to ask Pam to put up a slide, and we're going to talk about how we work as a faith, right? The first thing that we have is something called Unitarian Universalist congregational polity. And so what does that really mean? So we have, as you can see, we have the national organization, the Unitarian Universalist Association, and they have a set of bylaws. And those bylaws are what govern us and say what we are, and how we operate. And then next, we have our congregations, and they say we agree to abide by the bylaws that the national organization has, And then we, as the UUFLB, have created our own set of bylaws, and we have a set of bylaws that those of you that come to the congregational meeting or participate on the board know that that dictates how we operate, what we can do, and how we do things. And then each of us who are members knows that in our new member ceremony, we said some words, and we made a commitment to the congregation, and the congregation said some words, and the congregation made a commitment to us, and we became into covenant with one another. And that's how we work. It's a flat line where the members become the congregations, the congregation, and collectively all the congregations, they become the UUA. And we're committed in our principles, as we all know, to the democratic process. And so why is all of that important? Because we have the 7 principles, and the 7 principles actually live somewhere. They live in the national bylaws of the UUA. They live in the national bylaws of the UUA, and if you'll go to the next slide for me, Pam. And that place is called Article 2. So in Article 2, that's where our 7 principles are. And Article 2, I have some details of what Article 2 is. Article 2 of the Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws are titled The Principles and Purposes, and it's the foundational document that outlines our values and our purposes. It serves as the guiding framework. This is from the UUA's website. It serves as our guiding framework for our members, for our congregations and their members. And in 1987 was the last time our Article 2 principles and purposes were revised, 1987. Why is that important? It's only important because every 15 years we're supposed to revisit and revise our principles and purposes to make sure we're up to date. So 1987 is the last time we did it. 1987 plus 15 is not 2023. I promise you that. So we were behind in revising our bylaws. So in 2017, after the George Zimmerman acquittal, Paula and Bruce came together and they wrote the 8th principle. And they took it to the board of the UUA. And the board of the UUA said the best way to address this is by, 1, helping us do something that we're overdue in doing. And we're going to call a Article 2 review commission together. We're going to put your proposal into that process. So one of the charges of the commission is to consider the 8th principle. And that was a slow process. Unitarian Universalists, we moved through a very slow process. So between 2017 and 2021, we put together the committee and the commission, and they did a 2-year study of Article 2. And they came up with a 26-page report that's available on the internet if you're interested. It's the UUA Article 2 study report. It's free to download from your favorite service provider. And you can read the 26-page report, and it'll tell you everything about what they have decided to do, which is far more involved than the 8th principle. But the reason that it all started was because of the 8th principle. And where we are today is that out of this grassroots effort of 2 lay-led individuals in 2017, 223 of the 1,000 U.S. congregations have adopted the 8th principle to date. So we're almost at 25%, and there's been an accelerated number of adoptions as the conversations have continued to mature and progress, because we don't do things quickly. So I make a note, in one of the videos that I was watching, it was from 2019, and there were only about 20 congregations in 2019 that adopted. So about 200 congregations over the past few years have adopted. And I anticipate that out of the last, one more point on where we are today. When I was in Pittsburgh, what we did at General Assembly at Pittsburgh was the first procedural motion to move this 2023 2-year study from a study to an actual vote for amendment at the next General Assembly. The next vote will be next year. So this year there was an amendment process and a vote to move it forward to actually being considered to being adopted, because there's a multi-year process to adopting the change. So now, we know where it lives, we know what it's about, and can you just take us back to the language, because it's a lot of words and I've said a lot of words. Can you take it back to the language? Journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So, when my mother was a little girl, my mother had, we called it in our family, pigeon toes, right? She had an extreme case of pigeon toeing, and I was like, maybe people won't know what pigeon toes are. So I looked it up, and it's called in-toeing. So if any of you are in your medical classifications, in-toeing, and if any of you are still unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, it happens mostly with children, but when you're born, your feet, they naturally slant inward, and when you walk like a pigeon. And so my mother had this situation, and I looked it up, and this in-toeing condition, it's an interesting condition, because with most children, it naturally corrects over time. It just naturally fixes itself. Some children, it doesn't naturally fix itself, but they're able to correct it through basically attention. Paying attention to it, they can correct it. Some people require mechanical braces and the like, and some people require surgery. And so there's levels of difficulty to it. And so my mother used to tell these stories all the time, because my mother was one of the people that had to wear braces. And braces on your teeth, if you ever had that experience, you know that with the kids, that creates a certain amount of attention. She says that braces on your legs are even worse in terms of the attention that it gets from the other kids. So it was just one of the stories that she told a lot. But the other part of the story is that the braces worked. And the posture of her feet were corrected. And so why was that important, and why is she always talking about that with me as a kid? It may seem strange, except for as a kid, I was pigeon-toed. And it was causing me all kinds of social self-esteem issues because I walked different than the other kids. And she was telling me that it can be fixed and you don't have to wear these funny shoes. And boy, if you think this is bad, it was so much worse, right? And so one of the things that I've observed is I no longer walk, unless I'm extremely traumatized and going into my 5-year-old self, pigeon-toed. And it was through years and years of focus and attention. I didn't have to wear any corrective shoes. I didn't have to have surgery. But I had to pay attention for years about how I was walking and be like, no, turn that thing. There's a little bit more to the outside. And it corrected itself. Now, why does that story matter? Well, when you think about something like anti-racism, for some people, anti-racism will naturally correct itself. If you point something out, it'll just fix itself and it'll go away all by itself and it's all good, just like in-toeing. For some people. But just like in-toeing, it says I'm on a walk. Am I moving that much? I've been walking for 10 minutes, it says. That's good. I'm getting my exercise. But for some people, it's not going to naturally correct itself. And this is important, right? Because this religion has been around since 1790. And this is clearly something that's not going to naturally correct itself. It's not going to immediately become a diverse and vibrant multicultural community from a community that's 90% white, all by itself. And so for some individuals, and for some parts that become institutions as individuals, it's going to require that years of focus and attention like I had to give to my in-toeing. And for other individuals, there's an interesting story if you watch any of the clips. When we were adopting the 7 principles, there was an individual on the board who was very against adopting the 7 principles, particularly because of the first principle, the inherent dignity and worth of every person. And they give an interesting set of quotes, and he says, I'll tell you why the principles exist. I don't know how it got to this point, but he said the principles exist to change people like me, right? And so he recognized that the principles were trying to change his starting point, but when they adopted the principles, they reported in the video that he left the church. So he was unwilling to change, but he recognized that there was the mechanism for change. And so this is even more, as they said, they want to put it center, they want to centralize it. And it's so important because all of us, we're talking about equality and inclusion, and it includes more than just race, but race is one of the things that are central to the idea, but it includes gender and ableism and age. I was asked a question about when you guys will meet my girlfriend. That's the million-dollar question. But my girlfriend, she has a disability. She has a problem walking, right? And so in living for years with a person that has an ableism disability, it has made me more sensitive. And I promise you, for 45 years, I never thought about the issues of ableism, of limited access, because it didn't apply to me. And this was where it goes back to the George Zimmerman effect. Lots of people just couldn't see how it applied to them. They couldn't place them because they haven't done that work to get the toes to point back out. You got to do a lot of work to see how it applies to me. And so now this whole series has been about a challenge. And what is the challenge? The challenge I've been trying to do with each of our principles is bring it home for us and for us to live the principles in our life to be the change. And I want to give a lot of credit. I gave it privately to Pam again before service. But Oakley came to us at the beginning of the year or thereabouts as a worship committee. And he said, I would like the worship committee, as the president of the board, he came to us and said, I would like the worship committee to change some of the script at the beginning. Can you put up the slide, Pam, where I have the church and the 7 principles? I apologize, she wasn't ready for this part. But Oakley came to us and he said, I would like you to change some of the language of the script to articulate that as a congregation, we are actively, let me see, I wrote it down the way they said, we are a welcoming congregation committed to ending systemic racism with membership open to all. That's more or less how Oakley came to us as a worship committee, as an institution of the UUFLB. And he said, I want to center this in our script. Now, what's interesting, of the 223 congregations that have adopted the 8th principle, we are not one of those 223 congregations yet. However, when you talk about who's living and doing things that are imparting the 8th principle in their practices, I again want to congratulate Oakley, because before we adopted the 8th principle, we started to live and articulate its meaning and its purpose. And I created this slide, and the building is the wrong color in the background, but that's okay, we're going to get that updated. But we are a welcoming congregation committed to ending systemic racism. And why is it important that we say it and center it? I have, locally here, I have 8 nieces and nephews. I had breakfast with them all yesterday, except for one that's in college. And back in Huntsville, Alabama, I have 10 nieces and nephews. And then if I include the children from my ex, there's another 3 or 4 nieces and nephews out there. And it's a multicultural group of people. All of my nieces and nephews here in Newport Beach that were at brunch, very blonde, very blue-eyed, very Caucasian, right? My nieces and nephews from my ex-marriage are all very Persian, very Iranian. And then there's this interesting story. I'm in Walmart in Huntsville, Alabama, about 10, 12 years ago. I'm in Walmart, and that big aisle in the center of the food area, I'm in that part of Walmart. And way down at the other end by the frozen area, this kid comes into the aisle pushing a cart. And his name says West on the back. And I got excited. I was like, oh, that's so cool. There's a kid named Wes, and it's a little white boy. I'm like, oh, look at that little white kid named West. That's cool. There's another family named West. Now, pay attention. That's really cool. I love that there's a white family here in Huntsville, Alabama named West. 30 seconds later, my brother comes around the corner with his wife and the other two kids because that's my brother's adopted son. But in my mind, he was a stranger. At that particular moment, because it was a little white boy way up there, even though I know who my nephew is, and he actually is a little white boy, his last name is West, I needed to do some work with my intoing, because my brain couldn't even wrap myself around what I was looking at. And so here is the challenge for all of us. It's individually, it's hello. Individually, it's just like that moment where I was looking down the aisle and I saw my little nephew. And I have to recognize that there was something there that just wasn't right, because it was an impossibility that I could know this person if I can explain to you what I was thinking. It was black and white. It was very stark. And so I'm not going to make any endorsements or recommendations, but there are plenty of materials that can help us as individuals. Welcome, Kendra. Now that you're late, you have to come sing a solo. You know I'm joking. But welcome, welcome, welcome. And it's perfect because there's kids in the audience. Part of this would only work if they were kids. Hello. Because it's all about the kids. The reason that the eighth principle exists based on the originators, they said they created it for the kids. They wanted to normalize something for the children. And in fact, in addition to what we had up on the screen, the empowerment that this community has given me to become a leader within the community, again, is normalizing something for the children, because they're coming in and they see me up here. And for them right now, I think that's normal. So I want to pat us on our back, and it's our 75th anniversary. This is not exactly part of what we were trying to do, but this is the 75th anniversary of this organization. And just like we're charged to pay attention every 15 years to our principles and purposes, at 75 years, obviously, we're going to be challenged to do something different than we did 75 years ago. And so we're living that and we're doing that. And so back to where I was before we had the wonderful, untimely, and thank you for keeping all of our information flow and calendar alive, because you weren't here for the thank yous. Thank you, thank you, thank you. There are plenty of resources and tools to help you with your intowing, right? There's books on how to be an anti-racist. There's books on how to be a better ally. But we have to do the work. We have to continue to do the work, and we have to look at opportunities to do the work. I watched the movie Selma very recently, and there's a couple of interesting points. One, lots of people, because they don't put it in the movie, but they don't know that the white minister that gets killed is a Unitarian Universalist minister from Washington, D.C., Reverend James Reeb, R-E-E-B, right? That's really important. I haven't ever seen the statistics, but anecdotally, the majority of the white people that answered the call from Martin Luther King to come to Selma were Unitarian Universalists when you start talking about denominations. All of the Jewish community didn't come down. It wasn't a rotund response for the Catholic priest. When he called on the clergy to come and stand with him, the Unitarian Universalist clergy came down and stood with him. But what was important, that wasn't what I was trying to say about Selma. What happened in Selma was there was this moment where they showed that there was a very strategic purpose to everything that they were doing in Selma. There was a strategic purpose to the actions seeking to create a strategic goal with a strategic outcome. And there was some challenge to the the strategy, because the strategy was in part that people were going to have to be hurt on behalf of the officials and the authorities, and that was going to create a spectacle that was going to create pressure. And what they tried to show in the movie, because I wasn't alive at this time, but what they tried to show in the movie was through the strategy, they created pressure, so much pressure that the president of the United States had to do something. And so I say that because some of the things that we're going to have to do are going to have to be to the level of sophistication and strategy complication that it can start exerting pressure all the way up the food chain, both in our own association and our greater political world. And that has to come from the faces and the smiles that are in this room right now. Because we're the ones that Martin Luther King Jr. can't come and give a speech and tell us what to do, and we have to create the pressure and the ideas. But more importantly, like the eighth principle says, the challenge within the eighth principle is as individuals, we have to correct ourselves. We have to encourage and call out all of the injustices, because the important part about Selma and what the role of all of the white allies were in Selma is in that particular situation, and you can see and create corollaries and draw other opportunities, is they gave themselves up almost as shields. They used their privilege and their white body to intermingle and interdisperse themselves among all the brown and black bodies that were marching, and that caused pause and caused another problem strategically for the opposing side. And it was about the television cameras. So, again, the challenge is individually. We have to work individually to create our inclusion and equality in towing. Our inclusion and equality in towing has to be done individually, and we have to be radically honest with ourselves and see, is this a little issue that's going to correct itself after being recognized? Is it an issue that's going to require intent and focus and determination? Or is it an issue that's going to require some sort of brace, some sort of structure and change, or maybe even a radical surgery? That's my challenge to you on the eighth principle. And then as an individual, and then to the whole body, I challenge us to create a pathway so that we can take that number from 223 to 224, and we can be one of the next congregations to send in our affirmation that we too have formally adopted the eighth principle. And we can put in some anecdotal things about how we're living the eighth principle and some of the things that we're doing to continue as an institution to be more equal and more just. So that's the challenge for the eighth principle. I also want to just take a couple of moments, because this is our second or third conversation that we've had about the eighth principle. Second? Third? So it's the third conversation about the eighth principle. Question number one, do you guys think you have an understanding of what the eighth principle is now? Yes? Woo! Gold star for Donald, I'm going to tell my mommy. Two, we've had this conversation informally as a board, but does anybody have an idea about how we should go about adopting the eighth principle as a congregation? Because there's no rule for how to adopt a new principle in our book. Anybody have any ideas about how we would make a path towards adoption as a body? Rachel.
I would just say here's the principle, the board suggest we adopt it. Have people just email in the book, send it out, and then you go out, because Kendra doesn't help me. John, repeat that.
So the suggestion that came from Rachel was that we invite the board to put together a vote and send out a communication saying that the board has voted to adopt the eighth principle and moves it to the congregation. in the form of an e-blast. That e-blast will go out as an electronic invitation to vote to the body, and then we can bring that back and act on it accordingly. What do you have, Dara?
A simpler way of saying that is use the fifth principle, the right of conscience, and use the democratic process.
So we're going to empower ourselves with the fifth principle. So I like that. I like that. So that's what we're going to do. With the next meeting of the board, I'm going to make a motion to do that on behalf of Rachel and the body. And so now I'm going to invite the lovely Carol Cole to start making her way back up to the piano. But here is the challenge. I just want you to think about little Don Don and think about how I used to walk. And think about it and look for opportunities as you put this eighth principle into your pocket for the eighth session. And for this week, as you go about, look for opportunities for self-improvement and self-growth. Because again, it's about us being the change that we want to see in the world. And all of us have places where we're harboring a little bit of bigotry, a little bit of inequality, a little bit of unfairness in our worldview. And that's okay, and it becomes more okay if you do something about it. So that is my invitation to you. And now, the lovely Carol Cole